Hi everyone, this is Dan. By popular request, I'm going to run through the rulebook of the Gorgon's Loch for you. I'll pop this on YouTube and then I'll pop a link in the frequently asked questions. It is a very simple gaming system. It's called the Storm system, and this rulebook is obviously using the Storm system in the context of the Gorgon's Loch, so it'll give you an idea of how the rules work. As with any system, particularly one that's pre-production, as ours is, there are still a few tweaks here and there. We've spotted a couple of typos in here. All this stuff, of course, will be ironed out and laid out even more professionally than this following the success of the Kickstarter. So, without further ado, here is the Gorgon's Loch rulebook. Creating the dungeons of the Gorgon's Loch. How to create the dungeons. This is how you connect two rooms, and you use one of the lava bridge pieces, as I showed you yesterday on the stream, to connect them. In doing so, you can see how any room can be attached to any other room in any configuration you like. This we've done so that you guys can put together your own campaigns. You will notice that each room and corridor piece is surrounded by walls. This is intentional. Simply butt the pieces up against one another as shown on the maps, then place a 3 by 1 square door section over the gap, creating a break in the wall. It's a simple yet effective strategy, and it means that you can create your own campaigns using board layouts in whatever configuration you desire and using our board pieces. We're even producing whole building and garden layouts to enhance your play areas and make your homebrew games bigger and better than ever. Why? Because we love playing games, and we know that if you've purchased one of our games, then you love games too. Keep an eye on our website for ways to share your homebrew Gorgon's Loch scenarios. We'll be awarding prizes to the best new campaigns. We hope you enjoy the Gorgon's Loch. Thank you, Dan Grubb and the whole FBG team. So, the rules of play. I'm not going to go down and read the content, so we're just going to run through it. But the important stuff is, of course, the art credit goes to Bart Jock, the design credit goes to my dear wife, Gabby Grubb. And as far as the game development's concerned, that's my family, that's the Bilton family, Dave Hughes, Steve Trum. I designed the system, and it's called the Storm system. That's it. So, the Gorgon's Loch, introduction. The Gorgon's Loch is an exciting adventure game for up to 5 players. Navigate through a series of dungeon maps using cards, characters, and standard 6-sided dice to enrich yourself and defeat the Gorgon Queen and her forces. Introduction. The aim of the game is to defeat the Gorgon Queen and free your soul from her evil clutches by completing a series of progressively harder challenges set across 6 different dungeon maps. As you move through the dungeons, the enemies you face become stronger and more cunning. To help you defeat them, powerful potions, scrolls, armour and weapons can be found by searching the dungeons. The game can be played as a single-player lone agent campaign, but that is extremely difficult to complete all 6 levels this way. Beware! Hidden amongst the treasures of the Gorgon Queen's dungeon are roaming enemies, vicious traps and evil spells that could leave you battered, broken and defeated. If you die in the Gorgon's Loch, your soul is reincarnated at the start of the dungeon to begin your journey once more. You are the Gorgon Queen's playthings, and she will not let you leave without a fight. Good luck, brave adventurers. You will need it. Getting started. Dungeon 1. The Gorgon's Loch comes with a campaign of 6 ready-to-play dungeons. Set out the dungeon using the map and board pieces provided according to the instructions that accompany Dungeon 1. Create the pile of enemy cards by choosing only those enemies that are relevant to the particular dungeon. For Dungeon 1, that is 6 goblins and 12 skeletons, so create an enemy pile of only those 18 cards, give them a good shuffle, then place them face down on the table. This is your enemy pile. Choose your character. There are 5 characters to choose from, each has a different specialist skill. Choose wisely, then place your figure in the start room of the dungeon. Place the character card next to you and place 3 death markers near it. These are your lives for the scenario. Decide which character will go first by rolling 1d6 each. The highest goes first. If there's a draw, those players roll again until there's a winner. The starting player rolls 2d6 to determine their health points for the scenario. This amount is recorded on their health point dial. Working clockwise round the board, each player does likewise, rolling 2d6 to determine their starting health points for the dungeon and recording them on their health point dials. You are now ready to start the game. The starting player rolls 2d6 to determine their action points for that turn. This amount is recorded on their action point dial. The player then uses up all their action points, giving, taking, using, fighting, searching, and moving through the dungeon. Turns proceed clockwise until all players have had a turn. Then, if there are any enemies on the board, the enemy turn begins. Interacting with the dungeon. The Gorgon's Loch uses action points to allow moving, combat, searching, specialist skill, and trading as you make your way through the dungeon. Firstly, let's get you moving. You move around the dungeon one square at a time, at a cost of 1 action point per square. You may move in any direction, including diagonally. You may move through other players, though you must end your move on an empty square. You may not move through enemies. When entering empty sections with numbered spawn points, so for example if you were travelling from the start room here into this first room, you must stop on the central square between sections and roll 1d6 to generate enemies, whether or not the section has previously been populated. If the section contains either players or enemies already, no new enemies need to be spawned. Only empty sections with numbered spawn points need to be populated as you enter them. When standing on the central square of the room connector, your character is in both rooms and must obey the rules accordingly. I think we can move on from that. I think potentially we need a little more detail there about how the spawning works. If a room has 5 spawn points, for example, and you roll a 3, then the top card from the enemy pile will generate that enemy that goes on to number 1, the second onto number 2, the third onto number 3. And then that's it. If a room has, same room, 5 spawn points, but you roll a 6, we consider that a maximum. So essentially, if a room has 5 spawn points and you roll 5, of course you're going to populate all 5. If you roll a 6, you again will populate all 5. That's how it works. But maybe that needs making a little bit clear here. So I'll make a note of that. Combat. One aspect of the dungeon you will not be able to avoid is fighting. Many enemies roam the Gorgon's Loch and you will have to be prepared to fight them using your action points. Attacks are limited to 4 per turn and cost 1 action point each. On guard. You may attack up to 4 times every turn, at a cost of 1 action point per attack. You may attack and be attacked diagonally. You may not fire ranged weapons through other players or through walls. When an enemy is spawned, place its card face up on the table and place its figure either on its relevant spawn point or, if it's been found while searching, place it directly in front of the character who found it. Keep track of each enemy's health points by placing the corresponding number of heart counters on their card. When they lose a health point, remove a heart counter. When no hearts remain, the enemy is dead. Remove the card and place it face down at the bottom of the enemy pile and remove the enemy figure from the board. The number of health points an enemy has is shown on the top of their card with red heart icons. If you are killed during combat, you must return one of your death markers to the box. Place all of your possessions face down at the bottom of the search pile and return to the start of the dungeon. If you are killed and have no death markers left, you have exhausted your soul in this dungeon and must wait for your companions to complete it to join them at the start of the next dungeon, or watch them fail and join them at the start of their next attempt to defeat the Gorgon's Loch. All 3 death markers are restored at the start of each brand new dungeon for all players, but not in the middle of a live dungeon attempt. So what that means is you're going to get all 3 lives back at the start of each of the 6 scenarios within the campaign, not just at the very start and not while the dungeon is actually live and being played. So if you are killed to death, as it were, which is 4 times, then you will have to sit it out, unless of course you're running the solo campaign, in which case you will have failed that attempt at the dungeon. Next section is about searching. Searching. The dungeons are full of great treasures pillaged over the centuries by the Gorgon Queen's forces during her rise to power. Searching the dungeon allows you to find weapons and armour, health potions, powerful scrolls, or simply amass as much wealth as you can during your campaign. Riches might help in later scenarios. They might also make you a valuable target. Beware. The dungeons are filled with traps, enemies, and strange enchantments. Tread carefully, adventurer. You may search up to 4 times every turn at a cost of 1 action point per search. Beware of traps, evil spells, and random enemy encounters while searching the dungeon. Most scenarios require you to find missing items to complete the dungeon and continue your campaign, so search thoroughly and frequently. You may not search a room or corridor while an enemy is in it. Either vanquish the enemy or move to another enemy-free section or enemy-free corridor before continuing the remainder of your allowed 4 searches. Deployment of specialist skill, something that definitely interests a lot of you. There's been a few people asking both on Facebook and on the Kickstarter page, so let's have a look. Deployment of specialist skill. After spending centuries circulating the dungeons as the Gorgon Queen's playthings, you and your fellow adventurers have developed certain rare skills. These are extremely difficult to trigger, but if you are lucky enough to do so, they range from luck and greed to instant kills and even teleportation. Choose your character wisely. Each character has a specialist skill detailed on the back of their character card. Activating a character's specialist skill may only be attempted once per turn and costs 1 action point to attempt, whether successful or not. A specialist skill is only activated when a player declares they will attempt to activate it, then rolls 2d6 once and scores the maximum of 12, double 6. Scoring 1 to 11 does not activate the specialist skill and means the attempt to activate it has failed. If the player has any remaining action points, they must continue their turn as normal, otherwise their turn ends. Specialist skills. Ragnar Agathorn, instant kill. Instantly kills an enemy in any of the 8 squares adjacent to him. Erin Bloodborne. Teleport. Transport from her current position to an adjacent board section or corridor and place herself in a free square of her choice. Erin cannot transport to spawn points or onto scenario-specific tiles such as locks. Essentially, she has to land on an empty square, which definitely needs adding here. Julius Farcleaver. Luck. Search for and keep any single card in the search pile. The search pile is then shuffled thoroughly by another player before being returned face down to the play area. Norlessa Tundershack. Double kill. Instantly kills up to 2 enemies in any of the 8 squares adjacent to her. Can also be used to vanquish single enemies. Magnus Underhill. Bounty. Pick 5 cards from the top of the search pile, keep any cards of value, and return any negative cards to the bottom of the search pile without consequence. So essentially traps, wandering monsters, etc. Dark enchantments, they have no effect and off to the bottom of the pile they go. Next section's about trading. Trading. As this is a collaborative adventure, while moving around the dungeon it may become necessary to trade items with one another. For example, if a player were to search and find 3 different ranged weapons, it's usually a good idea to hand 2 of them over to other players, therefore increasing the overall attack range of your party. Trading health potions and magic scrolls is also a good idea in order to restore and reinvigorate the more battle-weary among the group. Sharing is caring. Trading between players during scenarios. To make a trade, you must have consent to give or take the items, and doing so will cost 1 action point per item to the player whose turn it is, whether they are receiving or giving the item. Trading parties must be next to each other. Diagonal trading is permitted. Trading between players after the scenario has ended. Players may trade at the end of one scenario and before they begin the next. This includes trading with players who were killed in the scenario. This helps replenish the possessions and weaponry of your fallen comrades. It allows you to make strategic decisions about how your possessions and weapons should be distributed, making the group as a whole stronger as you start the next scenario. Trading parties must consent to give or take the items, and trading between scenarios does not cost any action points. That's reasonably clear. Death and reincarnation, my favourite section. Remember this. You are already dead. Your party is made up of the souls of adventurers stolen by the Gorgon Queen and imprisoned in her dungeons as her playthings. Your enemies' souls are also trapped, but under the control of the Gorgon Queen they have fought for her for millennia and their loyalty is now absolute. The risk of failure is ever present in the Gorgon's Loch. Fight for your soul. Getting killed. It is impossible to die in the Gorgon's Loch while in possession of a healing potion or a restorative magic scroll. If your health is reduced to 0 but you own a health potion or a restorative magic scroll, you must use it. If all your potions run dry, your scrolls are spent and your health points are reduced to 0, you have failed. You must remove 1 death marker and return all of your possessions face down to the bottom of the search pile. You may then reincarnate your character to the start of the dungeon. When your next turn begins, you must first roll 2d6 to determine your health points for the dungeon. See point 4 in the Quick Start Guide. We'll get to the Quick Start Guide in a moment. Then roll for action points and continue as you would normally, albeit slightly more warily of the dungeon's dangers. If you die and have no death markers left at all, you have exhausted your soul in this dungeon, and must wait for your companions to complete the dungeon and join them at the start of the next dungeon, or watch them fail in their attempt and join them at the start of their next attempt to defeat the Gorgon's Loch. When beginning a new dungeon attempt, whether the party contains players killed in the previous dungeon or not, all 3 death markers are restored to all players. I think that's reasonably clear. Okay, meet the characters. Ragnar Agathorn, Viking, human. Driven mad by his imprisonment in the Gorgon Queen's dungeon, his Viking roots ensure Ragnar's fighting skills remain untarnished by his centuries of incarceration. Erin Bloodborne, assassin, elf, human. An elven half-breed, Erin's human mother was killed by a lichen hallwalker when she was very young. Erin vowed then to avenge her death, no matter the cost. Julius Farcleaver, mutant, human. A rare survivor of the Outlander Wars, Julius entered the Gorgon Queen's dungeon in the hope of riches and glory. That was many centuries ago. Norlessa Tundershak, warrior, human. An orphan of war and raised by orcs in the far mountains, Norlessa knows only violence. To defeat the Gorgon Queen is her greatest desire, for glory. Magnus Underhill, miner, dwarf. A renowned dwarven miner, Magnus dug himself into the Gorgon Queen's dungeon many centuries ago. He's been searching for a way out ever since. So we've met the characters. Who should we meet now? Let's meet the enemy. Goblin. Enchanted by dark magic and teased away from the catacombs beneath royal households in the far mountains, the Gorgon Queen uses these denizens of the night to torment those in her dungeon. What they lack in strength, they make up for in sheer will and are a relentless foe. Skeleton. Former human prisoners, these failed adventurers have been under the Gorgon Queen's spell for so long they've lost not only their minds but their flesh too. Only ancient dark magic keeps their rotten bones together, their remaining humanity reduced to instinct and swordsmanship. The skeletal bowman. Once proud and talented bowmen from the Outlander Wars, these fleshless warriors retain their keen aim and unflinching killer instinct. If you're in their line of sight, be prepared to defend yourself or be struck down by their lethal arrows. They never miss. Wild Hound. Formerly companions to orc soldiers on the battlefield, these snarling canines have been reduced to vicious, bloodthirsty beasts by the Gorgon Queen's dark magic. They are fast and powerful and will not stop their pursuit of any adventurer foolish enough to stray into their path. Harpy. These broken-winged, demonic killing machines sought out the Gorgon Queen to join her forces willingly. Betraying them, she trapped them underground. Unable to fly, they spent millennia crashing and flailing their way through the dungeon. They want only to chase, torment, and kill. It is extremely rare for a lone adventurer to make it past the dungeon where the harpies lurk. The Lichen Hallwalker. A lycanthrope is at its most dangerous when dark magic holds it half transformed between human and wolf. As tall as an elf and as fast as a wild hound, these crazed enemies are as powerful in combat as the Gorgon Queen herself. Walking the halls of the Gorgon's Loch looking for victims to unleash hell upon, these powerful enemies should be feared by all who discover them. The Queen's Guard. Half Minotaur, half demon, these form the Gorgon Queen's personal guard. Powerful, swift, and resilient, it will take a concerted effort to rid the dungeon of these demonic minders. Work together to vanquish this foe, or be defeated. And of course, the Gorgon Queen. Responsible for you and your party's incarceration, and the architect of the very dungeons you're trapped in, the Gorgon Queen is your nemesis. Her defeat will bring your soul and every enslaved soul around you peace and tranquility after centuries of imprisonment and torment. Defeating her is your chance to escape from her eternal game of death and reincarnation, and to continue your journey to wherever your deity deemed you worthy of going. Should she be victorious, however, you are surely damned to be a pawn in her terrible games for who knows how many lifetimes more. Okay, so the next section, should you use a dungeon master? A dungeon master is someone who controls the enemies. And forgive this, guys, because I know a lot of you do play these sort of games all the time. But please remember that this is pitched at people who maybe have never even heard the phrase dungeon crawler, and who are simply interested in a different type of simple D6-based gaming. A dungeon master is someone who controls the enemies, sets out and explains the scenarios of the campaign, and hands out any cards that are required. This game can be played with or without a dungeon master. Playing with a dungeon master. The dungeon master should oversee setting up the map and read out the relevant sections to the players at the appropriate points. The dungeon master is also in charge of handing out the cards when players require them and moving and attacking with the enemies. Playing with no dungeon master. The player who goes first should read out the relevant parts of the campaign, and the players should take cards from the search and enemy decks themselves when they need to. In the case of no dungeon master, the enemies follow a very simple set of rules once spawned. Rule 1. Enemies will move towards their nearest player character until they can attack. Rule 2. Enemies will only attack players once per turn if they can. Rule 3. Enemies do not need to use up all their movement to get into a position to attack a player. Rule 4. Enemies will continue to follow and attack players until enemies are killed, at which point they are removed from the board and their card returned to the bottom of the enemy pile. If an enemy kills a player character, it will move towards the next nearest player character on its next turn. So, the Quick Start Guide. This is a 9-point guide. Set up the board pieces according to the dungeon map. Number 2. Roll 1d6 to determine who goes first. Highest starts. Play continues clockwise. If there's a draw, those people roll 1d6 again until there's a winner. Number 3. Choose your character and place their card in front of you. Place your character's figure on any unoccupied square in the starting room. Place 3 death markers near your card. These are your lives for the dungeon. Number 4. Each player rolls 2d6 to determine their starting health points for the dungeon, marking them on their health point dial. Number 5. The player turn begins. Roll 2d6 to determine the number of action points this turn. Mark them on your action point dial. Number 6. Use your action points for moving, combat, searching, specialist skill, or trading. Using a card costs 1 action point. The following rules apply to every turn. You may search a maximum of 4 times per turn. You may attack a maximum of 4 times per turn. You may move as many times as your action points allow at a rate of 1 action point per square. You may move diagonally. You may trade items to from other players as many times as your action points will allow at a rate of 1 action point per item. And finally, you must use all your action points if you can. I'll just pause there, guys. There are a couple of situations when you're totally penned in by enemies and you've exhausted all your attacks. There are a couple of situations that was an example of where it's physically impossible to use up your action points, but in well over 90% of the situations you can. So which is why we've worded it. You must use all your action points if you can. Not being able to is extremely rare. Okay, number 7. Your turn ends and the next player's turn begins. If there are no enemies on the board when the last player's turn ends, go to point 5 and start again at the first player. Otherwise, go to point 8, which is the next one. And to spawn new enemies, see golden rule number 3, so we'll check that out in a second. Number 8, the enemy turn begins. Unless you have a dedicated dungeon master to make the decisions on their behalf, the enemies will move towards their nearest character until they can attack. Then will attack if they can. Enemies do not have to use all of their movement per turn. A ranged enemy will attack if a player character is in their line of sight. Skeletal bowmen rarely move once spawned unless they are chasing a fleeing character who is not immediately in their line of sight. And finally, when all enemies have moved and or attacked, go to point 5 and start the next round of players' turns. So, number 5, the player turn begins. And you sort of circulate your way around here. You soon get hold of the rules. It's very, very simple. Finally, the golden rules. It's a good idea. We've put these on the back. It's a good idea to have these out and open because the odd query that does appear is often answered by these rules. So, the golden rules. You must not search a room or corridor while it is occupied by an enemy. This applies even if you search an empty room and find random enemies. The room is now occupied, and the enemies must either be vanquished or you must move out of the section and into an empty section before another search can take place. Number 2. You must use all of your action points unless you are blocked from moving and have attacked 4 times and have either searched 4 times or cannot search due to enemies in your section. Number 3. This is about spawning enemies. When spawning enemies, place the first enemy from the top of the enemy card pile onto spawn point 1. Place the next enemy onto spawn point 2 and so on until the number of enemies matches the amount shown on 1d6. When entering empty sections with numbered spawn points, you must stop on the first square inside the new section and roll 1d6 to generate enemies. Now that's actually an error, and we've spotted this error. You don't stop on the first square inside the new section, you stop on the lava bridge, which is the red square directly between 2 sections. So we're well aware of that. So I'll just read that bit again. When entering empty sections with numbered spawn points, you must stop on the lava bridge and roll 1d6 to generate enemies, whether or not the section has been previously populated. If the section contains either players or enemies already, no new enemies need to be spawned. Only empty sections with spawn points need to be populated as you enter them. Number 4. If your character dies during gameplay, you must remove one of their death markers, return all their possessions face down to the bottom of the search pile and start again in the start room. If you die and have no death markers left, you have exhausted your soul in this dungeon and must wait for your companions to conclude their attempt at the current dungeon before rejoining them. Number 5. You must not enter a square you have already passed through in the same turn unless you have moved from one section, corridor or room, to another. So that essentially means you can leap from room, corridor, room, corridor, room, corridor to use up your action points. What you can't do is run around in a circle in the same room, going over the same squares. Which is an interesting mechanic because we have had people essentially forced to leave a room and enter an empty room with spawn points. So if they were allowed to just run around in the room, then that would be fine. But because they were essentially forced out, then they had to generate more enemies, and the Gorgon's Loch fun continued. Number 6. You may not move through enemies. You may hop over players, counting their square as one action point, but must land on an empty square. Enemies may not move through or hop over other enemies or players. Number 7. You may move and attack diagonally. You may attack and be attacked through doors diagonally. You may not, and finally, number 8, you may not fire ranged weapons through other players or walls. So all very simple. So there's a couple of tweaks in there, as mentioned at the start, but that is the current state of the rules of the Gorgon's Loch. I hope you enjoyed it, and that's it. So I'll pop this video up on YouTube, and then I'll add this to the frequently asked questions. Thanks very much, guys. Please keep spreading the word, and don't forget to use the short link bit.ly/join the Gorgon's Loch. Join the Gorgon's Loch is all one word, all lowercase. So bit.ly, that's bit.ly/join the Gorgon's Loch. Thanks a lot, guys.